Hello, listener. Nolan cutting in before tonight's story to let you know that next week, over on the Goblin Market Patreon, I'm going to be posting the first chapter of a novel called Skunk Ape. Subsequent chapters of this new serialized adventure will arrive every month hereafter until its conclusion. The short stories will continue, nothing's changing there, but Skunk Ape will only ever be available for Patreon subscribers. That's $3 a month for ad-free stories a week before everyone else, and it's the only place you'll be able to listen to Skunk Ape. Now, with that out of the way, here's the first in a loose trio of stories that you can call the Ohio Trilogy. Please enjoy Neighbors.
I met Klaus Darrow on move-in day, fall semester 2009, my freshman year at Wesleyan. Findlay Hall, second floor. He showed up with two guys from the moving company who, if they could speak English, didn't speak much at all. No family. He lived across the hall, and of the four of us within earshot while we arranged all of our stuff, he and I got along the best, right from the jump. Not that we were the best of friends or anything, but he was chatting with me and my family, and when we were done, my mom invited him out to dinner with us. We did pizza and movies together every Friday. Neither of our roommates ever seemed much interested in hanging out with either of us or their counterpart. And like I said, it wasn't like we were the best of friends or anything like that at all, but when it came time to sign up for next year's housing, we both thought it would be nice to get a room together. We could do our movie nights without worrying about holding some other roommate hostage to our strict routine. Klaus insisted the lights always must be turned off for movies, for example. Just little stuff like that. Not that he ever seemed to pay too much consideration to this roommate anyway. Maybe something I should have taken into account before signing up to take their place. Not that it was so bad or anything, just little stuff that makes a guy sort of eccentric as a casual or even closer friend might start to drive you insane with quiet, seething rage for no discernible reason when you live in the same box as them. It's not always rational. I'm sure there are things which I did too that made him fantasize about knifing me through the bottom of my mattress while I slept. Not that we weren't still friends, but at some point we stopped doing the movie nights. Someone was back at home one weekend or something, and we never really picked it back up again. I guess we saw enough of each other as it was. We were making other friends, or at least I was. There was never any real fight or falling out or anything like that, but when it came time to figure out the living arrangements for the following year, we both quietly made separate plans. Neither of us ever even consulted the other. We never really went out of our way to see each other after that. Now and then we'd cross ways in the dining hall or at a party, and it wasn't always friendly between us. Then we graduated, and I didn't see him for 13 years. I took my graduation money and the money I'd saved up working in the mailroom and took off for a year of stretching my legs and finding myself in hostels and train cars across Europe. It lasted a little less than 6 months, and then I was phoning my parents begging for enough cash to buy a ticket home. Determined thereafter to get out of the Midwest, I headed out to Stanford to get my master's, and after that to Johns Hopkins for my PhD. I wrote my thesis on honeybee psychology, presented it this past February, and by April I had to move back in with my parents. 31. My childhood bedroom after a decade. I'd spent all of my 20s with my head down, and now I was looking up at the world around me, and there was a pretty significant kink in my neck. I was sitting in bed scrolling through Facebook one day not long after when I saw Klaus's name appear. It was a photo of him standing next to a new Chevy Camaro. Straight-faced, arms at his sides. I don't know what made it stand out in the great stream of things, but I remembered it a few days later when I was trying to think of everyone I knew and put together a list of every job I might possibly get. I had no idea what Klaus was doing. He'd been a biology major like I had. Last I'd known, he was talking about becoming a surgeon because they made the most money, but I never found out if he applied to med school or anything like that. I called him up. We chatted for a little bit about whatever we'd seen in the news, how my family was, before he asked me what I was doing for work these days. I told him that I'd just finished my PhD and didn't know exactly what I would be doing now, and that I was just starting my job search. He asked what my PhD was in. When I told him, he didn't respond right away. "No way," he said. He asked if I was pulling his leg, and I told him that I was not. "This is so crazy," he said. "I literally work with honeybees at my job every day." He went on to describe the company he worked for, a startup attempting to develop the first vaccine for bees. "The pay is pretty great for what the work is," he said. He said that they were rapidly expanding and planning to add another 24 hives and hire a bunch more people by the end of the month. "The only catch is," he said, "you'd have to move back to Ohio." I thought about it. I didn't tell him I was already back in Ohio. "What part?" "Norwood." "I've never even heard of it." "You wouldn't have. It's about 2 hours southeast of Columbus. They need a lot of space to themselves." His father was part of some hobbyist investor group that had marked the company as one to watch, and he got Klaus an interview. "First thing after we left school, I took the test to get my real estate license," he said, "but that was not panning out the way he'd hoped. I took the job. By the end of the day, the company had booked a moving truck in my name for the following week. Klaus even offered to help me find a place to live. Without thinking too much about it, I decided to rent the first house he showed me. "All new appliances," he said. "Short commute. It'd honestly be perfect for you." There was nobody there to greet me when I arrived or anything like that, just the key hanging in the lockbox on the door. It was the last house on a dead-end street next to some woods. There was one other house across the street and no more for a while. You'd have to walk about a minute and a half before you hit the next driveway. The house across the street looked a lot nicer than mine. A lot more permanent, for sure. Simple, sturdy brick on the first floor and white-painted clapboard siding on the second. Mine was a modular house of some sort. I suspected it may have been some clever pushing together and gussying up of a couple of double-wides. Even the appliances felt like they were made out of particle board. It was all very adequate. I didn't have a wife or kids to please, and I'd spend most of my time at work anyways. I didn't need much more than a box to sleep in and sometimes cook dinner in, and that's about all it was. But all very new. The cabinets, the blind, some of it even still smelled new. It managed, most of the time, in spite of its slapped-together appearance and plastic feel, to fulfill the primary function of a building, which was to sustain in the mind of its occupants the illusion that they were somewhere different, a new place separate from the outside world. The few seams where the illusion began to falter were quickly covered up once I started moving in all of my familiar things, and the spots that couldn't be covered materially were quickly enough covered by routine and repetition, swept under the rug by the brute force of human imagination and subsumed into the larger mental gestalt of the structure as a solid house, rather than a bunch of flimsy vinyl boards stuck almost haphazardly into the cold and unforgiving earth. I might have paid the little nooks and crannies more attention if I hadn't been trying to learn the ropes and fit in at the new job, and enjoying it so much. I was finally making money, not great money, but good money, adult money, and doing everything I wanted to do. Granted, Klaus was doing the same work, only with a bachelor's and a real estate license, but it was a start. I was working with bees. For the first time in years, it felt like I had my hands around life, at least a little bit, for the time being. What more could I really ask for? I didn't see much of Klaus at work. I was responsible for one grove of hives. His was on the far opposite end of the complex. On top of all of the normal beekeeping responsibilities, the bees received lots of medicines and other supplements, and I was responsible for tracking all sorts of data and behavior. We were pretty opaque about where my reports went, and what exactly we were studying and all that. I tried to discern what I could, but it never bothered me too much. For the time, I was happy to collect a paycheck and care for the bees. Friday night, after my first week at the company, I was in my living room, finishing unpacking, starting to arrange my things just so, when there was a knock at the front door. It was Klaus. He had a beer in each hand and tried to hand one to me. Happy Friday, he said. He asked if I had my TV set up yet. The closest pizza place is about 40 minutes from here, so we should get our order in soon. There used to be a spot in the strip mall on Del Mar, but that closed like a year after I got here. It took me a minute to remember our old Friday movie nights. I looked outside and I didn't see any cars besides my own. Where'd you come from? I asked. He looked at me like he couldn't tell if I was joking. I mean, how far back are we talking? I mean, where did you park your car? In my garage, he said. It started to dawn on me. He pulled his keys from out of his pocket and pushed down a button. From the front window, I could see the garage door opening across the street. There was the Camaro. I'd never actually asked him how long he'd been there. He'd only ever said, a couple of years. Same for how old the company was. Pretty young, honestly, for this sector. Very nimble. When I learned the salary, I figured I could save up for a car like that in about 6 or 8 months. Not that that's what I'd want to do, just hypothetically. But that was before I'd realized what rent would be. All in with utilities and the like, I was paying about the same as many of my friends who lived in places like Denver and Chicago to live in Norwood, Ohio. Klaus said it was normal, unfortunately. How funny is that, he said, and clapped me on the shoulder. He pressed the button again and the garage band to close. Talk about a small world, huh? How funny. We were making the same salary as far as I knew, and his house was a lot bigger than mine. Took one look to see that, and I could barely afford my place with responsible budgeting. Maybe rents were lower back whenever it was that he moved in. I wondered if the same company might have owned both places. We started seeing a lot more of each other after that, and not only on Fridays. He'd come by the house for anything, it seemed, to borrow some milk, to give me a book he wanted me to read, just to open his garage and walk over with 2 beers to bitch about someone from work. I was friendly with everyone we worked with, but wouldn't have called any of them friends. I never saw any of them outside of work. I'd been there a few months when my air conditioner broke down. It was a window unit. Late July, maybe early August. I came home from work one day and found steam on the bathroom mirror. The thermostat of the unit said 8.8. That was just blowing hot air. I tinkered with it, gave it a good smack, unplugged it and plugged it back in. On, off, nothing. I went into the kitchen drawer with the menus and highlighters and found the lease and realized I didn't even have a phone number to call. Only a P.O. box to send the rent checks to. I could hire a contractor or purchase my own appliance and send a receipt to have my rent prorated. At the discretion of the holding company, Elite Property Management. The final page said, for all other comments and inquiries, and to reach the property's maintenance department, visit our website portal. I went to the address and was forced to talk to Alfred, a nearly useless chatbot which kept trying to report an emergency flooding issue and add a gratuity to my monthly payments. I eventually managed to cut through its protocols and reached a comment card submission page. I left a comment that my air conditioner was broken and needed repair or replacing. I showered before bed and had to shower again in the morning before work. My sheets were soaked through with sweat. I remember in school we all chuckled a bit when we learned the pioneers had lived in dirt houses, just dug them into the sides of hills, but turns out the little hovels we put ourselves in become sweltering coffins if not fed round the clock by air conditioning. Now who's laughing? At least the pioneers didn't have an electric bill. When I came home from work and went to unlock my door and felt cold air coming through the keyhole, I swear I nearly fell to my knees. There was a brand new unit in the window. There was still plastic wrap on one corner and not a trace of that miserable old piece of garbage. Klaus came by later to admire the new machine. Afterwards, we were sitting in lawn chairs in my yard, which was a featureless acre and a half-grass lot, and after a few IPAs, he started talking about how massive corporate interests ruined everything they got their claws into, and that they got their claws into everything, including Norwood. After the company had announced their plans to build their headquarters here, a couple of these real estate behemoths went and bought almost 70% of the available land around town. You'd think at least one of them could build a grocery store or something, I said. He said that one of them owned and operated the one big apartment building downtown, and I said that I wondered if they were renting my house to me. No, said Klaus, I'm pretty sure you're with Donalay Bay. That sounded familiar enough. It was a gray website, and that's all I could really remember, and Alfred in the portal. I asked him what rent was for that big 2-story house of his. I actually don't rent, he said, I own it. Really? I said, yeah, he said. It started to grow dark. There was one floodlight on the back of my house, crawling with moths and mosquitoes. Klaus cracked his last IPA. I wonder why we're here, he said. God? I said. No, I don't mean here at all. I mean right here, specifically, and not 20 miles farther down 71, or in Idaho, or Bangladesh. Cheap land? I speculated. Sure, but why here? There's land lots of places, a lot of it for cheap. But take upstate New York, for example. There's a lot of dead towns up there too, but up there you can see why they were put there in the first place, what made them once live. The canal's right there. You can see it written on the landscape why people would come and congregate at that place and not some other. You can see how and why it died with your own eyes. Down here, it's just... He gestured at the big empty yard around him. I don't know. Shit, man. Just why here, you know? Why not a mile west of here, or east? Why not build your house a block that way, or 15 feet to the left? I tried hard not to let him see me looking at my watch, but I had to hit a button to make the face glow. It's hard to picture anyone ever actually living here, or even deciding to. Well, we live here, I said. Yeah, and there's another identical corpse of a town 5 miles south of here, and another one 5 miles south of that. Get on any highway or country road going any direction, and there will be one every 5 to 10 miles as long as you can stand to go. Little reminders that something used to be here and now it isn't. He stood up and stretched and made like he was readying to leave. He'd finished his beer. You know, he said, George Washington was a land speculator, especially in the Ohio Valley. The bugs were growing worse by the minute. I stood up myself to bring an end to the evening's festivities. Well, I guess that makes this the Wild West, right here where we're standing, I said. Klaus grinned at me. The Northwest Territories. What's it feel like being a cowboy? All my hives at work were thriving, and the bosses always seemed very pleased with the reports that I was turning in. At least that's what my supervisor told me. I never actually met anyone at the company higher up than that I knew of. I had, or was given the sense that some of the other sectors weren't quite performing as well as mine. It was late in the summer. I don't remember what day of the week it was. I came home from work and there was a cage around my window air conditioning unit, and the temperature had been turned up to 76. I had to go through the same chatbot prompts each time I wanted to communicate with the rental company. I eventually managed to send a direct message to the company in 13 steps. That was the minimum as far as I can tell. And while at first I had mapped out the shortest route via a tested and logical path of dialogue, I realized pretty quickly that if you just said, let me send them a direct message, it might deny you at first, divert you, try to trick you, or even outright lie to you, even if you say, let me send them a direct message, please. But if you said it 13 times, it would relent and let you send a message just the same. Even if you evolved into saying something like, let me send a direct message, you dumb bag of shit. Cage, I typed. Why? I received an automatic email saying that I could expect a response within 72 hours. I waited. None came. You stupid motherfucker, times 13. Why is there a cage on my air conditioner unit? You do not have permission to enter my house when I am not there. 10 minutes later, a response. 62 too cold. Unnecessary. I like it cold. It's my house. Send. A day later, too much electricity. Direct message, goddammit, times 13. I pay the electric bill. I almost said the goddamn electric bill out of habit. Then it was the weekend. I wanted to go home. I mean home, to my parents in Shaker Heights. Get out of the house and out of Norwood. But I went for a walk instead. And I thought that if I was going to live here, then I should live here and give it a chance. I would go home for Thanksgiving. I always started to get homesick around this time whenever I was in a new place. The first couple of months were always too exciting and full of newness to really have any time for wallowing like that. I walked for hours and saw nobody. I went around the town twice, taking a different route each time. I did not go out by work, which was out way out on the far edge of town, down along a dirt road. Almost every house I saw was either crumbling or plastic, and there was a lot of empty lots and a lot of rubble. All of the new developments, all of the new company people essentially, had marked themselves with AstroTurf lawns. On Monday, I came home from work and checked my email and saw that I had received a reply from the company at 3:08 on Sunday morning. Where's the unit out? Needs premature replacing. Then, at 3:12, you already broke one unit. I had survived a surprise round of layoffs at work, and as the company restructured, and I was feeling bold. Fuck you, 13 times. Please do not enter my domicile without permission again. I lingered over it and added, Thank you. Then I opened my half-size fridge full of IPAs and started drinking. Klaus, who I had not seen all weekend, came knocking just after sundown. His surviving the layoffs had never been in doubt. He didn't notice the cage over the window air conditioning unit until I pointed it out. He laughed. You do like it pretty cold in here. At least 76 is pretty reasonable. I said that it was like a sauna. No, he said. It's a normal room temperature. It's that or 78. He seemed confident that the layoffs would be good for the company in the long term. He mostly wanted to talk work. Those assholes paid for that new air conditioning unit with my money, I said. I stood up and went to my closet for my toolbox and came back with a drill. I'm going to write them an email, I said, and within a minute and a half I had my laptop open and had told Alfred to go choke on a fat one 13 times. Let this serve as notification that I will be removing the cage from the window air conditioning unit myself. And I did. The following afternoon I had a reply. That would be in violation of the terms of your lease. If such action is taken, we will respond accordingly. Well, I waited for further response, and there was never one. As I suspected, things can slip through the cracks of these big companies if you drag them out long enough. Out of curiosity, I looked up other listings in the area, and toward the bottom of the page, I found an old listing for my house. The rent listed was exactly half of what I was paying. Work continued to be good, even if I had begun to feel a bit distant from most of my coworkers. It wasn't that anything had happened between us, it just felt like I should have become a bit closer to them by now than I was. Where did all of them go after work? And what did any of them do when they weren't here? They were all as perfectly cordial whenever we crossed paths as they had always been. But that's where it ended. To a person. The leaves were turning, and it was probably October, maybe late September, when I came home from work and found an eviction notice on the front door. I took it down and read the finer print and saw that it was really only a threat to get me to reattach the cage to the window air conditioner unit. Well, whatever. I barely use it anymore anyways. It was around that time that construction fences and a little bobcat showed up in Klaus's front yard. I asked him about it the next time I saw him. He said that he was putting in a koi pond and a bridge and a cherry tree and a little miniature pagoda next to a bench. Trying to squeeze in all the digging before the first freeze, he said. Part of the restructuring meant that half of our department were recategorized as contractors rather than employees. Of course, seniority being what it was, among other factors, Klaus was never considered for the contractor half. I'd been meaning to wind off my Wellbutrin for a while, even before I lost my insurance. I'd been on it for so long, and it wasn't ever as if it was perfect. It was only that its pros outweighed its cons during a certain season of my life, and I didn't want to be dependent. I didn't want to see the world through the lens of the drug forever. My circumstances changing like they had, who knew? Maybe I'd find I no longer even needed it. And even if I did, well, if it was life or death, I imagined I could find a way to afford it, some crafty budgeting and a bit of skimping. I learned that I was due for a raise of 5% at the end of the year, and then a day later I received a letter in the mail from the rental company letting me know they were raising the rent that exact amount, and also instituting a mandatory new $50 administrative fee for each payment. It was around that time, during the earliest morning frosts, when the fog came crawling out of the woods, that Roger began coming around. Roger was a small black cat with green eyes and a scar on one ear. He didn't wear a tag or a collar or anything. That was just what Klaus called him. He's your cat? I asked. No. He seemed to laugh at the very notion of it. Roger is nobody but Rogers, but you must be doing something right if he's even let you see him. He was sitting patiently on the sidewalk outside my door one morning when I stepped out to leave for work, like he'd been waiting for me. He wasn't interested in being scratched or petted, but he didn't leave either. He avoided me but hung around, like he only wanted to observe. I went back inside and poured a little bowl of milk and left it on the stoop for him. He and the milk were gone when I returned at the end of the day. That was all fine, but it became more disconcerting when I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find him sitting on the window ledge looking in at me. It always seemed to me like there was something going on a little bit more behind his eyes than with most animals. In my more paranoid moments, I'd have said it felt almost human, like he was working for someone else, reporting back on my movements. Those would have been some pretty boring reports. The only novel thing I'd done in weeks was hang a shelf above my bed for books. I woke up to pee one night, and when I went to the kitchen to get some water, he was sitting on the table. He nearly gave me a heart attack. I had to run him out of the house. I didn't see him for a while after that. Once we'd winterized, things began to slow down for the season at work. They cut my hours in half. I did the math. The little bit I'd been able to save would cover the difference enough to keep me current on rent through the winter, but not by much. I'd have $50 a week to eat. Come November, Norwood looked deader than ever. I was going on a lot of walks these days, mostly just to get out of the house. It was not lost on me how much I was paying for a place that more and more I could not stand to be. Although, a couple of weeks after the cage incident, I received an email. It said, "Valued tenant, this will serve as a notice of work to be done on your property between the dates of yada yada and yada yada. In a courtesy to all of our customers and an effort to maintain EPM's position on the cutting edge in terms of offering the best rental value properties in the world, we will be installing central air conditioning in all units. Please tell Al your preferred time of installation, give him express written permission for us to enter your domicile, and we will do the best to accommodate." Sure enough, I came home from work one day and there was a new thermostat, this one in my bedroom, on the wall directly opposite of the foot of my bed. I played with it for a second just to check it out, but obviously didn't need the AC in November. There was a brewery in Columbus Klaus was fond of. He came over on Saturday, just before Thanksgiving, with a 6-pack of special porter that they sold only for the holidays. We watched a college basketball game. I wondered out loud if it was strange that there was only one door in a house of this size. There was a place in the back where a door was supposed to be, but it was about 5 feet off the ground. The deck had never been installed beneath. I wondered if it was against fire code. Is there even a fire code for, he waved his hands around, private residential? I said that I was pretty sure there was. The game went to halftime and commercial, and I turned the volume down, and you could hear the traffic on the highway far off in the distance. People traveling home from work, home to warm, bright kitchens and families. I realized I hadn't been on the highway in months, just walking endless doomed circles around the same weed-choked ruins day after day. The quiet was starting to get palpable. "How's the shelf treating you?" asked Klaus. It took me several seconds to figure out what he was talking about. Had I mentioned anything about the bookshelf to him? I told him that it was good. Nice to finally have him off the floor. I laid in bed that night, unable to sleep, staring up at the ceiling and the bookshelf a few feet below it. Had we come back here at some point? We rarely went anywhere but the living room. I would have remembered. When was he ever out of my sight? Coming back from the bathroom, maybe, but why would he come in here? To snoop? But to snoop for what? At some point I did manage to fall asleep. Wednesday I only worked till lunch, and then it was home to pack for the long weekend at my parents'. The sun was beginning to set when I headed out. I was barely out of Norwood before I realized that I'd forgotten my whole travel kit with my toothbrush and razor and deodorant. I turned around. When I pulled into my driveway, the lights inside my house were on. I sat in the car, dredging through my memory, trying to decide if I had remembered to turn them off when I left. I was quite sure that I had. Of course, it had been a little bit lighter out then, and maybe it would have been less noticeable. I turned off the car and approached the front door and listened for a moment. I turned the handle and opened the door silently. The living room was as I had left it, only not quite. I couldn't put my finger on it. It felt as if the space had been violated. Was it my imagination? Or pheromones? Unfamiliar boot tread marks slowly rising out of the carpet like dough? Then, without warning, without a sound, someone walked into the room from the kitchen. A foreign body in the bloodstream, a moth on the camera lens. It was Klaus. He seemed as surprised to see me as I was him. He left the stove on, he said, and then nobody said anything. And then he cleared his throat. His face was turning red. It was a narrow path to fit past me to the door, but he went for it anyway, mumbling something out about Happy Thanksgiving on his way out. It made for a strange drive home and hung over me all weekend. When I returned, it was dusk and everything was blue and slate. The snow on the ground was half melted and half dirty, and the vapors were hanging in the air between the trees like soggy ghosts. The little red flag on the mailbox was raised. There was an unsealed envelope inside. I took it to my kitchen with my dirty laundry and the leftover turkey. On Elite Property Management LLC letterhead. Dear Tenant, pursuant to Section 4G, subsection 12, under the Timely Action Clause, a representative of holding company may enter the property without properly notifying the tenant if said representative observes a clear and present threat to the integrity of the property. so long as the representative vacates the premises and receives the tenant's permission to stay on the property within a reasonable time frame after the threat has been dealt with. Thank you. It was unsigned. I was not normally a confrontational person, but I had no problem walking straight across the street, right past the heated koi pond, and knocking on Klaus's front door. The door probably weighed half as much as my house. It took him a long time, but he eventually opened the door. "Are you my fucking landlord?" He winced. "That's sort of a complicated question." "What's complicated? What does that mean? What's elite property management, huh?" I realized that I was shaking the envelope almost right in front of his face and stopped. He held his hands up in front of me with his eyes closed for several long seconds before he resumed talking. "If you look at the corporate structure..." "It's you! It's just you! What structure?" He pursed his lips and looked at the floor. Then, after a few more long seconds, he said, "Are you done?" "Why do you charge me double the normal rent? First 3 months and last upfront. A $3,000 security deposit." "Because," he said, finally looking at me, "because you're a friend." "What?" I practically screamed it. He shook his head. "My dad always said never to mix friends in business." "What are you talking about?" I was trying hard to control the volume of my voice. "I can't have people just using me for discounts. There are risks. I have to cover myself," he said. I looked it up. He'd bought his house 3 years ago for $56,000. He bought the land, which would become my house at the same time, for $3,000. He never came around anymore after that. Maybe a week or two later, I saw a shed begin to go up in his backyard. I assumed it was to hold all the tools that he'd be needing to maintain his new Japanese garden, and at first it seemed like it was, but not long after it was finished, a moving truck appeared in his driveway, boxes stacked by the shed door. I snuck over one night to look. It was flat-pack furniture. A few days later, I saw a new car parked in the street, and there was Travis from account retention. He'd been caught in the big net of the latest round of layoffs. I walked by his office on my way to the bathroom every day, and it had been dark and locked for several weeks. Now here he was, moving into the shed. He always used to smile and wave at me when I came by his office if he wasn't on the phone or busy with something else, but in our normal comings and goings as neighbors, he never even acknowledged me. I wonder what Klaus might have told him about me. Sometime in January, my water heater broke. I told Al to go to hell 13 times, and 45 minutes later, Travis was on my front stoop with a cigarette in his mouth and his whole body slouching to the right under the weight of the toolbox he was carrying. There was almost a rodent-like quality to his posture and movements that I'd never noticed before, maybe because I saw him mostly sitting down behind a desk. I offered him some water, but otherwise didn't try to talk to him too much, but stayed nearby while he worked in case he wanted to start talking to me. He didn't. He had to go back into the shed for something 4 or 5 different times. He was at it all afternoon and seemed like he was on the verge of a panic attack almost every time I saw him. It really did start to seem hopeless until he came into the kitchen just after sunset and tried the sink and made hot water come out. He was even more relieved than I was. I started watching Klaus's house more carefully after that. I'd never noticed before, or at least never clocked it as strange, but he kept all the curtains drawn on every last one of his many, many windows, even in the middle of the day. Now it seemed excessively secretive. Since I'd moved in, had I ever actually seen Klaus out and about in the daylight? I was sure that I'd had, at least I must have, but could not for the life of me pin down one definitive example. Once the notion had crept onto my head that I couldn't get it out for several weeks. Even at work, my mind wandered constantly back to the subject. He always seemed to be coming around after work, after dinner, beers, a movie. I can only ever recall having seen him once or twice at work, briefly in passing a long time ago. The company staggered our commutes to mitigate traffic jams, but thinking that was only confirmation bias. It had to be. It was an absurd idea. I lived across the street from the man. Saw him regularly. Of course I would have seen him during the day, but when? I absolutely could not recall a time. He could usually go a round or two longer than I could. Often I'd fall asleep during whatever movie we were watching. He never struck me as a night person. Never seemed particularly anxious about the sun. There are only so many walks you could take. With so few hours of work, I began to go a little stir-crazy, sitting in a rotation of the same couple spots around the house for hours and hours, day after day. As the temperature dropped, my gas bills went up, so I signed up to start delivering food. I would make a little money and reduce the amount of time that I would need to heat the house each day. A minor problem was that there were no restaurants in Norwood. The old diner in Clifford was open when I first moved there, and their eggs and coffee were not half bad, but the cook died and there was nobody left to fill in for him, so the owners decided eventually to close. So for every order, I found myself driving at least 40 minutes out of town, and even that would mostly just get me a couple fast food joints. Most places were at least an hour away. At $2 or $3 a trip, the pay wasn't even covering the gas. Fewer people tipped than you might expect. Most would prefer to not even see you. Whenever somebody recognized me from work, they'd lock the door and pull the curtains. I was spending money I didn't have to bring people cold mush. I took a delivery to a town a couple miles down the road for a good tip, and the guy came out into his front lawn pointing a gun at me because he didn't know his daughter had ordered boneless wings. I stopped after that for a couple weeks. I made up my mind that Saturday morning that I would march over to Klaus's door and drag him out into the sunlight. The excuse hardly mattered. I'd tell him I needed butter to bake a cake for my dead grandma's birthday. I woke up full of nerve and resolve and steeled my will while eating my Cheerios at the kitchen table, and my phone rang. I was being called into work. I needed the hours. I was back home before dinner, but hardly interested in any sort of confrontation, only laying down. Sunday morning I woke to robins and chickadees outside my window, and the sun beaming full force through the curtains. I could feel the sheets baking where they were lit. For about a month, sophomore year of high school, I wore a chain and cross, and I went into the box of miscellaneous stuff I hadn't unpacked looking for it. No luck. Instead, I grabbed a head of garlic and dropped it in my jacket pocket. I probably wouldn't need it. Of course I wouldn't need it, but nobody would know I brought it. The cold air was almost enough to stop me on my own stoop, but pushing ahead anyways, it became like a wind at my back, nudging me forward, swelling my chest and sharpening my senses. I knocked at the door. Without the stimulant of the frigid wind, I might have found the first excuse to scurry back to my own door, might have let myself assume after 10 seconds that he wasn't home or wasn't going to answer. But as it was, I was willing to wait for him all morning if need be, or at least until the wave of moxie broke. I knocked again, hard enough that there would be no mistake. Hard enough that he'd hear it in whatever far-flung room he might be in, hard enough to wake my dead grandma. A door opened, but it wasn't Klaus's. Travis was standing in his doorway in his pajamas. "What do you need?" he asked. I asked him where Klaus was. He said that Klaus was in Columbus for the day and asked me again what I needed. "Butter," I said. To my surprise, he went to his mini fridge and handed me a stick of butter. I put a frozen pizza in the oven and came back 20 minutes later, and it was still frozen. The oven was cold. I went and knocked on Travis's door and told him my oven was broken. He took a look and said that the gas line had been disconnected and that he had to reconnect it. "What's he like to work for?" I asked. "Mr. Darrow?" "Mr. Darrow? Man, what? Were you making like 15 grand a year more than him?" "He's a fine boss," he said. "He's a good boss." "Compared to who?" "To anyone. He's fair. He gives me my holidays, pays me, gives me a place to live." "He rents you a place. He doesn't give it to you," I said. "He's a good man. Why do you insist on tearing him down? I used to be his roommate in college. Did he ever tell you that?" "He does a lot more than you do, frankly. Didn't you two work the same job? At least he's providing housing and jobs." "A job. So my job doesn't matter?" I meant to catch Klaus when he came home, but I let my guard down at some point that night, and when I looked across the street I could see the lights back on in his house. Monday we learned the company was going public. There was a lot of cheering at the news, even some hugging. That evening after dinner, Klaus was on my doorstep with a six-pack in hand. It was freezing out. "Yeah, come in," I said. He was settling into the couch before I even realized what I'd done. Was that a hard and fast rule? A law of physics? I didn't see how it could be. Just a custom, then observed by choice or good taste. Did the invitation need to be renewed daily each time they left the premises, or was it good in perpetuity? "How many do you have?" he asked, cracking the first beer. "How many what?" I asked. "What do you mean what?" he said. "Shares." "Shares of what?" He looked like he realized for the first time that I might not be joking. "The company, of course," he said. "What?" I said. "You're joking, right? Tell me you're joking." I wasn't joking. Apparently almost every employee brought on before me, and especially everyone who worked in the office, but also plenty who worked in the fields, and even several who were hired after me, were given a number of shares as part of their compensation package. I'd never even known to ask about it. Klaus had never even thought to ask me. "That's the only reason I was ever working for such crap wages to begin with," he hollered at me. He quit a week later and sold his shares, and then on Monday it was announced the company had been sold. They'd been telling people off the record that the vaccine was imminent. They had it. It was practically down to formalities. Turns out somebody came in the morning after Christmas and found 90% of the vaccinated bees dead. Turns out my colonies were a control group. I was just taking care of some bees. Half the board resigned. A couple who stayed tried to argue that they were still relatively close. I mean, it was a setback, no doubt, but they were close. And that was the word coming from R&D. Learn from what went wrong, tweak, try again. But it was down to tweaks, they assured. Not good enough, said the rest and the new owners. They were going to pivot to selling honey. We were told that in an email that they would change with very little notice. The next day, they announced they were changing the name of the company to Buzz. They hired a consulting firm who told them to sell the bottles on a subscription basis. In late February, it snowed, and one last really deep cold snap settled over everything. My house felt as brittle as the crust of ice atop the snow, like the wall would shatter if I punched it. I was working less than ever in those days, and yet constantly tired, just a lethargy I could never seem to shake. Even if coffee perked me up on the surface, or 9 hours of sleep got me pretty lucid for a morning, then 2 or 3 nights a week I'd lay there for hours just trying to fall asleep. A couple of days ago I had a headache that I just couldn't kick. I felt even more tired than usual. In the evening I started to feel nauseous and couldn't even eat dinner. When I woke up yesterday, my pillow was soaked. My head was on fire. The first thing I did was run to the bathroom and puke. Now my bones felt tired. All morning I phased in and out of full lucidity, like I was looking at the world through a frosted shower curtain, like even my own thoughts were kept at a distance from me behind the curtain. I tried to heat up some soup for lunch, but the stove was fucked up again, and I gave up and waited for a wave of nausea to replace the hunger. I was so hot that it made my heart race a little bit just to touch my forehead. Each time I would think, surely it cannot have been that bad, that warm, and each time it was worse than I imagined. An idea came to me, and I tried turning on the new air conditioning and cooling down the room to 65. I could freeze it out. I didn't hear any machinery turn on anywhere, but the display seemed to indicate that it was working. Later in the afternoon, when the sun was already starting to make its descent, I finally managed to fall asleep after I replaced the sheets. Fitful at first, 5 minutes here and there before being woken up by a coughing fit or having to sit up and wonder if I needed to run to the bathroom, or the jolt of coming fully back into the front of my brain and realizing that my mother was not in the room with me, and neither was my 6th grade soccer coach. But eventually I passed out and my body weighed on the mattress like an Egyptian sarcophagus. When I woke, it was dark and the world was still, and I could tell that I'd caught it at some uneasy hour, near midnight if not past it, when it wasn't expecting visitors. The night lulls us under its spell, so that even if we aren't asleep by 2 in the morning, we're too enchanted to see its true strangeness. It's only with 7 a.m. eyes and a proper REM cycle, the cold, pointed clarity of a newly broken fever, and the dryness of the mouth, that the hour's grotesqueries become clear. The rustle of my arm over the comforter was like an ocean. It had no echo. I tried to fall back asleep, to hang on till sunrise, but it was hopeless. There is a reason we retreat into dreams to pass this time of night. There was something sinister about the world I saw outside my window. I went to the kitchen and brewed some tea to soothe my throat. It felt like a bold statement against the night, to turn on the light and kettle. When I sat by the window to drink it, I could see my breath, my little winged armchair for reading by the window, my one indulgence in such a cramped space. The moon was the most vivid I'd ever seen it. Crisp, like someone had nudged the focus ring a bit, and we realized we'd been looking at things just a smidge blurry all along. The wind picked up, and the boughs at the top of the pine trees were thrashing around in the wind like they were possessed. I read for a while and felt myself getting sleepy, then tried to pounce on that feeling but only ended up back in the dark and still unable to fall asleep. The glow of the streetlight at the end of the road falling across the comforter on my chest, listening to the wind scream at the house, and the house constantly bracing itself. There was something else beneath that wind, cutting through. Crunching footsteps coming down the walk toward the front door. It was after midnight. I thought of Roger, but they were too heavy for a cat. Where did Roger go when it was this cold? The footsteps came right up to the front door. The materials were so thin that it was easy to trick yourself into thinking the front door was open a crack, even if you were just listening from the other room. There was the faintest jingling, like little bells. Then a key slid firmly into the lock. I heard the deadbolt turn. I don't know what came over me. Fight or flight, it was neither. I simply lay there and pretended to be asleep. I could do nothing else. My spine was jelly. The boots were too heavy, too solid for the construction of the house. They came straight around to my room. They watched me, I assume. I wasn't sure what else they could be doing. Completely silent for a good 2 or 3 minutes. The crazy part is I'd spent half that morning in between puking and carving a wooden stake that was sitting in the closet. Maybe part of me was relieved for that. I'm an academic, for God's sakes. I didn't sign up to see if I could push a sharpened piece of wood through a man's sternum. But what if I felt him coming closer, bearing down, closing in over me, blocking out the light, breathing hot and damp on my neck? I heard fidgeting with something plastic. I opened my eyes a little bit. There was a man standing by the foot of the bed, looking at the wall, messing around with the thermostat. The clinking and jiggering almost sounded like he was taking it apart, and just like that he was gone. I don't even remember hearing the door open and shut. The house was such a small box that I had a pretty innate sense of if anyone else was in any part of it. I would certainly not be going back to sleep now, but there were many hours till dawn, and I dared not turn on any light and let Klaus know that I was awake. I sat by the front window and looked at his house across the street. The koi pond. Was it a trick of the eye, or was it really that much higher up than mine? Like it was on a subtle little rise I'd never noticed? I saw no signs of activity within its walls. I heard the heat click on and quietly hum away for a minute. I realized it wasn't any cooler in the house. I didn't hear any air conditioner pumping away trying to get to 65. Eventually dawn came, and it was as though the sun thawed my nerves of their fear, and I could finally stir, and finally stand from the little winged armchair by the window. But I wanted the sun much higher in the sky before I would feel comfortable going over there. I waited till a few minutes after 9:30. No doubt he would be fast asleep by then. Still in my pajamas, I stuffed my shirt full of garlic, my pant pockets full of garlic, my socks full of garlic. I put on a coat and stuffed those pockets too. I slipped a hammer in one pocket and tucked the stake into the back of my waistband. I wondered if Travis would become violent with me. There was no sense on waiting for him to leave. All he did was sit around all day waiting for something to go wrong in Klaus's house or mine. I'd planned on breaking a window if I had to, but his door was unlocked. Small town, I suppose. It was silent on its hinges. It was dark inside, but enough light snuck past the curtains to see by. I looked around for a basement and found only bathrooms and closets. The whole place was covered in what I can really only describe as merchandise. There were movie posters and concert posters and comic action book figures and replica swords, signed guitars, a life-size stormtrooper helmet, and a decorative Dick Tracy license plate. Toys and figurines and memorabilia from Elvis to Rambo covering damn near every inch of the place. I was looking for soil, for dirt, the loam of his homeland, a big coffin, maybe mahogany. I went upstairs, up the creaky and noisy stairs. There was an unearthly light coming from beneath the door at the end of the hall. I approached and stood in front of it listening for maybe 5, maybe 10 minutes, trying to amass enough courage to open it. But each time I managed some, it seemed to slide through my fingers like sand. Then, before my mind had even been alerted of what my body was doing, let alone asked permission, it reached out and grabbed the doorknob and turned. Standing in the doorway, for a moment, I thought I had found what I was looking for. It was glowing under the lid. It was a tanning bed. I threw it open and he started yelling and flailing. He was blind and deaf. He threw off his goggles and headphones. "My sink is leaking," I said. "The kitchen is flooding." "What the fuck are you doing in my house?" said Klaus. "Go tell Travis." "Travis is gone," I said. It sounded more ominous than I meant it to. "Christ," he said, "I'm not even dressed." I tossed him his robe off a nearby chair. He stumbled, grumbling, into his slippers and picked up his mug of coffee and shambled, sighing, down the stairs behind me. We came to the front door, and I was still waiting for him to show some more hesitancy. It's like he was calling my bluff. I opened the door. Sunlight came pouring in. He squinted and shielded his face with his forearm and took a sip of his coffee. Christ, he said. I think I just started saying no over and over under my breath. And come on. Come on. I hooked my elbow under his and dragged him out into the stoop, onto the lawn. No, no, no. Come on. He protested as far as I was going to make him spill his coffee. Fuck, no, I said. Why? What? God damn it. I let go and lost my balance and fell into the pond. The yard was definitely sloped. I'd run out of words. I was growling as he helped me out. Never mind, I said, shivering. There's no flood. Sorry, I must have dreamt it. He looked over at my house. It was still standing. It looked dry from here. Are you all right? He asked. I had to take a second to catch my breath. My teeth were like tap shoes. Roger was sitting at the edge of the woods with his back arched, watching. Never been better, I said. You might want to see a neurologist, he said. I only say that as your friend. My uncle used to have weird dreams and sleepwalk sometimes too, and I'm not sleepwalking, I said. Oh, he said. All right then. So no water damage then? No water damage, I said. He stuck his finger in my chest, smiling. Don't forget, he said. Rent's due next week. He snapped his fingers and walked back inside. I admired the solid sound his door made when it closed. Then I went home.